Arizona is famous for its breathtaking deserts and endless canyons, but beneath that rugged beauty lies a vast, unforgiving wilderness where people can vanish without a trace. Today, we're covering the 10 most mysterious disappearances in Arizona history, cases that completely defy logic. If you love deep dives into the unexplained, please take a second to hit subscribe and like the video to support the channel. Now, stay on the trail and let's get into it. I want you to think about a specific kind of evening. You know the one. It's January, but it's Arizona, so the air's just cool enough to feel nice after the heat of the day. Kids are still outside, bikes are in driveways, a neighbor is walking a dog. Someone's got the news on through an open window. The whole neighborhood feels like a deep exhale. The workday is done, dinner is almost ready, and everything is exactly as it should be. That is Mesa, Arizona, on the evening of January 2nd, 1999, a Saturday. The holiday break is winding down, school is coming back, and the neighborhood near Southern Avenue and Mesa Drive is doing what it always does, absolutely nothing unusual. And then the ice cream truck comes around the corner, and two sisters hear it. Mikelle Biggs was 11 years old, 6th grade honor student, played the clarinet, and wanted to be a Disney animator when she grew up. Not a vague childhood wish, but a real, focused plan that she talked about with the kind of conviction that makes you believe it. Her younger sister, Kimber, 9 years old, described her as an angel. Not in the way people say that after someone is gone, the way you say it about a person who genuinely lights up a room. Mikelle grabbed 2 quarters, exactly enough for a popsicle, and headed outside to wait for the truck. She was riding Kimber's bike in lazy circles in front of their house, listening to that familiar jingle getting closer. 2 quarters in her hand. A perfectly ordinary evening. The kind of evening you don't remember because nothing happens, except this one did. Kimber was outside with her. They were both waiting for the truck, listening to the music. It was maybe arguing lightly the way sisters do about who gets the better flavor. But after a few minutes standing in the cool January air, Kimber got cold. Just cold enough to make a decision. She told Mikelle she was going inside to grab a jacket, and a warmer jacket would mean she could sit on the porch steps instead of standing in the street. She went inside. 90 seconds later, she came back out. The ice cream truck music was still playing in the distance. The street looked exactly as it had, except Mikelle was gone. The bike was lying on its side in the road. Right next to it on the asphalt were 2 quarters, and the bicycle wheel, Kimber noticed this immediately and has never stopped talking about it, was still spinning, still moving, like the bike had just been dropped seconds ago. Kimber went back inside and told her parents. Her parents ran outside. The street was empty in both directions. Within minutes, they were knocking on neighbors' doors. Within the hour, police were on scene, and over 1,000 volunteers had gathered to search. The response was immediate, massive, and total, and it found nothing. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. Mikelle Biggs had evaporated from the front of her house in the time it takes to find a jacket. Let's sit with that 90-second window for a minute, because I think we move past it too quickly when we talk about this case. 90 seconds. Count it out. 1, 2, 3, 4. All the way to 90. That is not a long time. And in that window, here is what had to have happened. Someone, a predator in a vehicle, had to be driving down this residential street at exactly that moment. They had to spot Mikelle. They had to make the decision to stop. They had to pull over. They had to get out, or open a door, or beckon her close enough. They had to get an 11-year-old girl, a girl who was not a small child, a girl who was old enough to know exactly what a stranger approaching her meant, into that vehicle. And then they had to drive away, completely silently, without a single neighbor, without Kimber's parents through the window, without anyone on that street hearing one sound out of the ordinary. Think about the spinning wheel. That detail is haunting for a reason that goes beyond grief. A wheel doesn't spin on a bike that's been slowly tipped over or gently set down. It spins on a bike that was dropped mid-motion or ripped out from under someone. That wheel is telling you this was sudden, violent even, and yet no scream, no shout, no sound of a struggle. Kimber was inside, yes, but the front door wasn't soundproofed. Her parents were home, neighbors were out, The street had people on it. How does a forceful abduction happen in complete silence? Now, here's the thing that investigators have wrestled with for 25 years. The ice cream truck driver. He was there. He was driving the exact route. He would have passed right by Mikelle at or near the moment she vanished. He was investigated extensively, thoroughly, by both Mesa police and the FBI. And he was cleared. His route, his timeline, his background, all of it checked out. He wasn't responsible. But here's the question that stays with you. If the ice cream truck driver was innocent, then someone else was driving down that street at the same moment. A random stranger. He is at the exact 90-second window that Kimber stepped inside, on a residential block with no major through traffic. Either this was a predator who had been watching this neighborhood for days or weeks, who knew the girl's routine well enough to capitalize on a 90-second vulnerability, or this was one of the most horrifyingly timed acts of opportunism in the history of Arizona missing persons cases. Neither option is comfortable. One implies a stalker. The other implies a level of terrible luck that's almost impossible to accept. Then there's D. Blaylock. Blaylock was a neighbor. He was identified as a person of interest in the early investigation. Police searched his house on the night Mikelle disappeared, but they did not have a warrant for a trailer that sat on his property. By the time the warrant was secured, the trailer was gone, physically removed from the premises. It was never forensically examined. Never. Now. I'm not going to tell you D. Blaylock was responsible. That would be irresponsible. He was never charged, and in the United States, that means something. But I'm going to ask you the same question investigators asked themselves. If you live next to a family, you know their patterns. You know when the girls go outside. You know that the ice cream truck comes around at a certain time. You know that its music covers sound. You know which windows face the street and which don't. A neighbor has information that a random passing stranger doesn't. And a trailer that disappears before it can be searched raises a question that never got an answer. In 2018, something strange surfaced in Neenah, Wisconsin. A dollar bill was found with a handwritten message on it, it claiming to be from Mikelle Biggs. The message referenced her name and her abduction in Mesa, Arizona, specific details not commonly known outside of people who'd followed the case. Police noted the name was misspelled and that the bill itself was printed after 1999, which made a literal communication from Mikelle impossible. Almost certainly a hoax. But the level of specific knowledge in that note, the Mesa reference, the name, the framing, made investigators pause long enough to examine it seriously. Because that's what this case does to you. It makes you examine everything. Because nothing about it follows the rules of how a crime is supposed to work. Crimes leave evidence, crimes create noise, crimes have witnesses. This crime left 2 quarters and a spinning wheel and absolute, total silence. In the weeks after Mikelle disappeared, thousands of tips poured into the Mesa Police Department and the FBI. Volunteers searched fields, washes, and every open space between Mesa and the surrounding desert. Her face was on flyers, billboards, and milk cartons. The community response was extraordinary, and it found nothing. Not a single piece of physical evidence beyond what Kimber described in those first frantic minutes. No body, no trace, no witness who saw anything they were certain of. Kimber Biggs grew up. She got older, had her own life, and she never stopped. She has spoken publicly about her sister for over 2 decades, doing interviews, maintaining awareness, pushing the case back into the public eye every time it starts to fade. Because here's what Kimber knows that you and I can only imagine. She was the last person to see her sister alive. She went inside for 90 seconds. And that is a weight that doesn't get lighter. Mikelle Biggs would be 37 years old today. She wanted to make animated films. She had 2 quarters for a pop cycle and a plan for her future, and a sister who adored her. And what I keep coming back to, what I think makes this case different from almost any other, is the setting. We tell ourselves that danger lives in the dark, in the remote places, in the alleyways and the abandoned lots. We comfort ourselves with geography. We think, not in our neighborhood, not on a street like mine, not at dinner time with the lights on and people home and a jingle playing down the block. But Mikelle Biggs was taken from exactly that street, under exactly those streetlights, with exactly that jingle playing. She had 2 quarters in her hand and she was 30 feet from her front door. No clues, no footprints, no witnesses, just the sound of the ice cream truck growing fainter, and a wheel still spinning in the road. Let me tell you something about Buckeye, Arizona in late June. It's not just hot, it's a different kind of hot, the kind that makes you feel like the air itself is trying to kill you. We're talking about surface temperatures, baking well past 115 degrees by midday. The ground around here is fractured volcanic basalt, razor-edged rocks, chest-deep ravines, and zero, absolutely zero shade. You step off the asphalt, and nature immediately starts working against you. Your water evaporates before your body processes it. The heat distortion on the horizon makes it nearly impossible to tell which way is which. People drive past this stretch of Sun Valley Parkway every day and think, God, I'd never want to break down out here. And they're right. Now picture that landscape. Hold it in your mind. And now I want you to picture a guy who was not afraid of it. Daniel Robinson was 24 years old on June 23, 2021. He wasn't a lost tourist. He wasn't a weekend hiker who misjudged the trail. He was a professionally trained field geologist working for a company called Matrix New World Engineering. That means his entire job was to drive into remote desert terrain, take scientific measurements, assess the earth beneath his feet, and drive back out safely. He was trained to do this. He had done it before. The desert was his office, his workspace. He knew exactly how dangerous it was, which is exactly why he came prepared for it. So when Daniel Robinson drove into that desert on June 23rd and never came back out, that's not just a tragedy, it's a puzzle. Because a man who knows the desert this well doesn't just disappear into it. Around 9 a.m., Daniel arrived at a remote well site near the intersection of Sun Valley Parkway and Cactus Road. Standard morning. He was there to run hydrological tests, essentially checking underground water sources for the construction projects, slowly eating into the desert around him. His co-worker, a pump station worker, was there too. And here's where the first thread starts to pull loose. The co-worker later told investigators that Daniel seemed off. He was staring into the desert, not focused on his work, not his usual self. He made a few strange comments that the witness couldn't quite explain. And then, without finishing his assigned work for the day, Daniel Robinson got back into his blue 2017 Jeep Renegade and drove deeper into the desert, not toward civilization, away from it. And that is the last verified human contact anyone had with Daniel Robinson. 9:15 a.m. His father, David Robinson, filed a missing persons report that evening at 7 p.m. when Daniel failed to come home. Police began ground searches the next morning, June 24th. They tried to ping his cell phone. Nothing. They combed the surrounding area. Nothing. Weeks went by. The Buckeye Desert, in 115-degree summer heat, refused to give up any answers. Then, on July 19th, nearly 4 weeks after Daniel vanished, a local rancher found something out in a ravine, approximately 3 miles from the last known job site. It was Daniel's Jeep Renegade, flipped over, heavily damaged, airbags deployed. Okay, tragic accident, car crash in the desert. A man stumbles out, disoriented, wanders into the heat. That's the story that starts to form in your head, right? That's the narrative that begins to make a kind of awful sense. But then you look at what was at that crash site, and the story falls apart completely. Daniel's clothes were found near the Jeep. His work vest, his shirt, his pants, his boots, all of it left behind at the scene. His wallet was there, his cell phone was there, his water was there. Daniel Robinson was apparently nowhere. This is where law enforcement and Daniel's family started telling very different stories. And the evidence, the actual forensic evidence from that crash scene, is what I want to walk through slowly. Because every single piece of it raises a question that nobody has satisfactorily answered. Start with the clothes. The official theory, the one the Buckeye Police Department has leaned on from the beginning, is that Daniel experienced some kind of psychological or emotional crisis, crashed his Jeep, and wandered into the desert where he succumbed to the elements. Fine. Let's follow that logic. You crash your car in 115-degree heat. You are in a remote desert with no shade. You need to survive long enough for someone to find you. What do you need more than anything? You need your boots. You need your clothes. That fabric is the only barrier between your skin and sun radiation that can cause third-degree burns within minutes. You need your water. You need your phone. Now tell me why a trained field geologist, a man whose entire job is desert safety, would strip off every piece of protective gear and walk barefoot into that same desert. Then not just leave it behind. Leave it in a pile. A deliberate pile. His boots sitting there neatly, as if someone decided they wouldn't be needed anymore. Police have mentioned something called paradoxical undressing, a real phenomenon where a person experiencing severe confusion, say from a head injury, might remove their clothing. But paradoxical undressing is associated with hypothermia, with freezing temperatures, not with a man walking into a desert that is actively cooking everything in it. The logic doesn't transfer, it doesn't hold. But here's the thing. The clothes are almost the least strange part of this. Let's talk about the Jeep's black box when forensic analysts downloaded the vehicle's internal data. This is standard procedure. Every modern car records its own operational history. They found something that stopped investigators cold. The airbags deployed during a crash. That's the initial impact. But after those airbags went off, the vehicle's ignition was cycled, turned on, and attempted 40 separate times. Think about that for a second. 40 times. Someone, after this crash, sat in or near that Jeep and tried to restart it again and again and again. That's not confusion. That's desperation with a purpose. That's someone trying to get that vehicle running for a reason. Maybe to get cool air from the AC. Maybe to charge a phone. Maybe to drive out of there. And this went on for an extended period of time. And it gets stranger. The data also indicated the Jeep was driven an additional distance after the initial crash. On a vehicle with deployed airbags and severe damage, in a ravine. Hold on, let's look at that again. The car crashes hard enough to flip and deploy airbags, and then someone drives it further. How does that work? Who does that? And then just walks away from everything, including their water and their wallet? Daniel's father, David Robinson, and private investigator Jeff McGrath have pointed to another angle entirely: the job site itself. The area around Sun Valley Parkway has been identified in law enforcement discussions as a corridor that intersects with known drug cartel transport routes. There were individuals at or near the worksite whose behavior struck investigators as suspicious. Pete McGrath has argued openly that the crash scene may have been staged, that Daniel may have encountered the wrong people that morning, and that someone else is responsible for what happened next. There's also the 4-hour gap. Daniel was seen driving away from the well site at 9:15 a.m. The crash data puts the impact at approximately 1 p.m. That's 4 hours of driving in a relatively contained search area without a single piece of construction surveillance footage picking him up. Construction was happening all around that desert, cameras everywhere, and nothing. Where was Daniel Robinson for 4 hours? The third theory is medical. The airbag deployment was a violent crash. A crash violent enough to flip an SUV can cause traumatic brain injury, the kind that scrambles a person's decision-making instantly. This could explain the 40 ignition attempts. A man with a TBI trying to process what just happened to him, operating on pure instinct. It could explain the clothing removal, and it could explain why he walked away without his survival gear, because he was no longer capable of understanding that he needed it. But even this theory runs into a wall, because the desert floor around that Jeep was searched extensively. Cadaver dogs, thermal imaging, helicopters. If Daniel Robinson collapsed within a reasonable radius of that crash, they would have found him. The desert, brutal as it is, was cooperating. It was giving up its secrets. During the search for Daniel, investigators and volunteers found multiple sets of unrelated human remains scattered across the Buckeye Desert. The desert out there was, in a grim phrase that made the local news, like giving up its dead. Bones from other missing people, other tragedies absorbed by the landscape over the years were surfacing. Even Daniel's own father found a human skull during one search operation. The desert was yielding its dead, just not Daniel's. David Robinson did not go home after his son vanished. He moved from the East Coast to Buckeye, Arizona. He organized civilian search parties. He hired private investigators. He walked that desert himself, week after week, through the brutal summer heat that took his son from him, or hid him, or swallowed him, or was simply the last landscape Daniel ever drove through. David Robinson was out there looking, and he found other people's sons and daughters in that desert, just not his own. Daniel Robinson was a trained geologist, a man who studied the earth for a living. Though he understood desert survival, he knew what the Sonoran Desert could do to a human body. He was 24 years old. He had a future. He drove to a job site on an ordinary Wednesday morning in late June, and somewhere between 9:15 a.m. and 1 p.m., something happened that we still cannot explain. His clothes are still there in evidence, his wallet, his water, his boots, the Jeep that was driven 11 miles after a crash that should have ended its journey, 40 attempts to restart an engine that had already given up. Daniel Robinson has not been found. His case remains officially open. And somewhere out in the fractured volcanic earth and the deep lightless ravines of the Buckeye Desert, whatever answer exists is still waiting. Tempe is one of those cities that has two completely different personalities depending on the clock. During the day and into the early evening, it's a college town. Arizona State University's main campus sits right in the middle of it, which means it's loud, crowded, and perpetually active. There's a density to the population that creates a kind of diffuse safety. People are everywhere, eyes are everywhere. The college town feeling, the sense that you're surrounded by other people your age, all doing the same safe, ordinary things, gives you a comfort that isn't entirely warranted. But Tempe at 4 a.m. is a different city. The bars have last called, the crowds have thinned to nothing. The wide, well-lit main streets give way to apartment-lined side streets where the lighting is uneven and the traffic is sparse. On a June night, the air is still warm from the day's heat, which means people have their windows open, which means sounds carry. But at 4 in the morning, there are almost no sounds to carry. It's the specific quiet that exists between the end of the night and the beginning of the morning. Nobody's watching. Nobody's out. That is the world Adrienne Salinas was moving through on the morning of June 15, 2013. Adrienne was 19 years old, a community college student navigating the particular chaos of early adulthood, classes, roommates, a boyfriend, the kind of relationship drama that generates late-night phone calls and impulsive decisions that feel enormous in the moment and ordinary in retrospect. Her friends described her as responsible, grounded, not reckless, not in over her head, not connected to anything dangerous. She was a 19-year-old having a bad night, which is an experience so common it barely registers as noteworthy. Except this time, the bad night didn't end. June 14th, a Friday night, Adrienne was at a party with her roommates and her boyfriend. Arguments happen at parties. This one wasn't unusual in its cause or its heat, but it was enough that Adrienne left early, upset, needing distance. She drove back to her apartment near 5th Street and Hardy Drive and tried to let the night reset. It didn't. Sometime around 3:30 in the morning, she made the decision to drive to her boyfriend's place to talk it through. A quarter mile from her apartment, she hit a median and blew out 2 tires. Front-end damage. The car was going nowhere. She abandoned it, left it right there, where it sat and was found later, and walked back to her apartment in the dark. She got home, changed her clothes, put together a small bag, and at 4:53 a.m. she called a cab company. She told the dispatcher her pickup location, her apartment complex, and was told a car was on its way. The dispatcher confirmed the address. Adrienne confirmed she would be outside, waiting. That call is the last recorded communication from Adrienne Salinas. The dispatcher would later say she sounded calm, tired maybe, but calm. At 5:07 a.m., the cab arrived at the pickup location. No one was there. The driver waited, tried calling the number, got nothing. Eventually moved on. At 5:07 a.m., the exact same minute the cab pulled up, Adrienne's cell phone stopped transmitting. It dropped off the network entirely, not powered down normally, gone, no signal, no last location ping, nothing. In 14 minutes, between 4:53 and 5:07, something happened to Adrienne Salinas, and no one witnessed any of it. A massive search launched across Tempe. Her wrecked car was found near her apartment, confirming her account of the night. A witness described seeing someone matching Adrienne's description walking along Hardy Drive toward a nearby convenience store in the pre-dawn hours, consistent with someone heading outside to wait for a cab. CCTV footage from a park in the area captured a figure walking in that direction. That was the last visual evidence of her. On August 6, 2013, nearly 2 months later, a property owner near a desert wash in Apache Junction discovered human remains. Apache Junction is 30 miles from Tempe. Dental records confirmed the remains were Adrienne Salinas. 14 minutes, that is the window this entire case lives inside. Let's really look at it. Adrienne called for a cab at 4:53. She confirmed her location. She was calm. She was going somewhere specific, her boyfriend's place, which means she wasn't in a panicked, irrational state. She had a plan. She had just enough time to put together a bag before making the call, which tells you she was thinking clearly enough to prepare. This is not a woman in crisis. This is a woman with a destination, waiting on transportation. The cab takes 14 minutes to arrive. In those 14 minutes, Adrienne goes from standing in a parking lot with her phone to completely unreachable, with her phone dead, in a location that is 30 miles from where she was supposed to be. So what happens in 14 minutes? The most likely answer is terrible in its simplicity. It was 5 a.m. on a residential street. Adrienne was standing outside, alone, waiting for a car. From a distance at that hour, in that light, she would have been watching for approaching headlights. Any car that slowed down near her would have gotten her attention. A predator doesn't need a long window. A predator doesn't need a plan beyond recognizing that a 19-year-old girl is standing alone on a dark street at 5 in the morning with nowhere to go. This is what investigators mean when they use the term predatory opportunism, not a targeted attack, but a collision between a vulnerable moment and someone who exploited it. If a car slowed and someone called out to her, asked if she needed a ride, she might have walked toward it thinking her cab had arrived early. 14 minutes is more than enough time for that exchange to go wrong. But here's the thing that doesn't fit neatly into that explanation. Adrienne was standing outside an apartment complex. At 5 a.m., these buildings aren't completely dead. There are early risers, people heading to work, light sleepers with windows open. The area around Hardy Drive is densely populated by college standards. It is not a truly isolated location. A violent abduction, a woman being forced into a vehicle against her will, creates noise. There would have been a sound, a shout, a struggle, a car accelerating hard, and 11 people tried to call Adrienne's phone in the minutes after she disappeared, suggesting her immediate circle knew something was wrong almost immediately. Nobody reported hearing anything, which brings us to the 30 miles. Adrienne's body was found in a desert wash near Apache Junction, well outside Tempe, well outside the search radius that investigators initially worked. She did not walk there. She had no working car. Somebody drove her 30 miles east of where she disappeared, and then her remains ended up in a wash basin after a period of time that allowed significant decomposition. The desert east of Phoenix is exactly what it sounds like: open, remote, and efficient at concealing what's put into it. And then the monsoon came. In Arizona, the summer monsoon season doesn't politely deposit water, it floods. The desert wash systems, dry creek beds most of the year, become violent channels of moving water and sediment in a matter of minutes when a storm hits upstream. By the time investigators reached Adrienne's remains in early August, the monsoon had done what it does to everything it touches. Her remains were badly degraded, disarticulated, scattered by the force of the floodwater over a wide area. Investigators searched a 6-mile stretch of that wash for additional evidence: her phone, her bag, any clothing, anything that could tell them more about how she got there and what had been done to her. They found almost nothing. The medical examiner could not determine a cause of death. The manner of death could not be officially established. The water had done what water does. It had moved everything, buried some of it under feet of new silt, and carried the rest to places a search team couldn't reach. The evidence that might have named her killer was distributed across miles of desert floor, and most of it was gone. The FBI opened a case. A $20,000 reward was posted for information leading to the identification of whoever was responsible. Years passed, tips came in and ran dry. The case remains officially unsolved with no named suspect and no arrest. Whoever did this to Adrienne Salinas has never been caught. They had a window of 14 minutes, a deserted street at 5 in the morning, and the particular advantage of a victim whose phone cut out at the exact moment she needed it most. They drove 30 miles into the desert, and they left her there. And then the monsoon did the rest, erased what the investigation might have found, buried what the desert might have surrendered. Adrienne Salinas was 19. She was having the kind of bad night that millions of people have. A fight with someone she cared about, a car accident, a need to talk it through, a cab called in the dark. Those are not reckless decisions. They are ordinary ones. She did everything a person is supposed to do in that situation. She got off the road. She called for a ride. She waited at the right address. The only thing she couldn't account for was what was driving past at 5 in the morning while she stood outside alone. The cab arrived at 5:07. The driver waited. Nobody came out. And somewhere between the call and the arrival, in 14 minutes of Arizona darkness, a 19-year-old girl with a small bag and a destination met something that had no business being on that street. And the desert, as it has done so many times in this state, held its silence. Scottsdale, Arizona runs on a specific kind of mythology. The luxury cars, the golf courses, the spa resorts, and the rooftop bars in the neighborhoods where the HOA dues are higher than most people's rent. It is a place that is extremely good at looking like nothing could ever go wrong. The streets are clean. The neighbors wave. The houses are large and locked and filled with people who believe, genuinely believe, that the suburb itself is a kind of protection. On April 10, 2001, at exactly 8:42 in the morning, one of those houses exploded. Not a gas leak, not an accident. An explosion engineered with enough precision that the blast blew out windows on neighboring properties and threw debris halfway down the block. Neighbors spilled out of their front doors. People a mile away felt it. 20-foot flames were visible from the highway, and by the time firefighters forced their way inside and found what was left, it was clear that the fire was the least of what had happened in that house. Inside the rubble were 3 bodies: Mary Fisher, 38, her daughter Brittany, 13, her son Bobby, 10. They were a church-going middle-class family. Their neighbors described them as normal, nice, the kind of people you wave to in the driveway. And then there was the 4th member of the family, Robert William Fisher, 40 years old, former Navy sailor, respiratory therapist, competitive hunter and hardcore outdoorsman who had spent years learning how to move through wilderness and survive in it. A man who, according to people who knew him well, had a personality that could shift in an instant, charming and capable on the surface, controlling and cold underneath. A man who, investigators would later learn, had been terrified of one specific thing above all else: losing. His family, his control, the life he had built. Robert Fisher was nowhere to be found. When the medical examiner examined the 3 bodies, the findings changed the story entirely. The fire hadn't killed them. Mary Fisher had been shot in the back of the head. Brittany and Bobby, the children, had their throats cut, both of them, while they slept. The fire was set after the fact, a deliberate attempt to destroy evidence and almost certainly to buy time. And it was not a careless fire. Investigators determined that Robert Fisher had pulled the gas line from the furnace and positioned a lit candle in a room. He calculated, correctly, that it would take roughly 10 hours for enough gas to accumulate and reach the flame. That meant he committed the murders sometime around 10:30 the previous night. The explosion happened at 8:42 the next morning. He had been gone for nearly 10 hours before anyone even knew there was a crime. They found his ATM record. At 10:43 p.m. on April 9th, meaning after the murders, after the gas was already seeping through the walls, Robert Fisher drove Mary's silver Toyota 4Runner to an ATM and withdrew $280 from her account. Not his, hers. And then he drove away. Police issued an alert. The 4Runner was missing. Robert Fisher was missing. The FBI got involved. Every highway out of Arizona was flagged, but Fisher had a full night and morning head start, and he had used every hour of it. 10 days passed. Then, campers hiking in the Tonto National Forest, roughly 100 miles northeast of Scottsdale, found the 4Runner pulled off and hidden in the brush near a remote trailhead. The vehicle had been wiped clean. Forensics found nothing useful inside. No prints, no hair, no trace of where Fisher had gone. But waiting outside the car, hungry and shivering and unwilling to leave, was the family dog. Blue. Still guarding the vehicle. Still there, after 10 days for whoever came back. Nobody came back. A massive search operation launched immediately. Over 100 officers from the FBI and Scottsdale PD fanned out through the surrounding wilderness. The Tonto is not casual hiking country. It is deep ravines, jagged ridges, and a complex network of cave systems that snake through the limestone for miles. Search teams crawled through passages with flashlights and thermal imaging. Bloodhounds worked the terrain. Helicopters covered the ridgelines. They searched for weeks. Not one piece of biological evidence, not a hair, not a boot print they could confirm, not a scrap of clothing. Robert Fisher had either gone into the earth, literally, or he had walked out the other side. Not the tree teat cordy. Prat. There are two theories about what happened to Robert Fisher after he walked away from that 4Runner. And I want to take them seriously, both of them, because both of them have real problems. Theory 1, he crawled into one of the cave systems, went deep enough that no search team would reach him, and died there. His body either decomposed completely or was scattered by animals, which is why nothing was ever found. This is the theory that lets you sleep at night. The monster is dead. He's in a hole somewhere, and the forest dealt with it. But here's the thing. Look at the profile. Robert Fisher did not make impulsive decisions. This was a man who slit his children's throats and then calmly pulled a gas line and positioned a candle with a 10-hour delay built in. He did not panic. He did not rush. He calculated. He drove to an ATM and withdrew $280 from his dead wife's account, and then he drove 100 miles to a forest he had visited 2 weeks earlier. And we'll get to that, and he wiped the car clean before he left it. Every decision in this sequence was deliberate, controlled, premeditated. Does a man like that walk into the woods to die quietly? A man that arrogant, that controlled, that obsessed with maintaining the appearance of being untouchable? I'm not sure he does. Now let's talk about the dog. Because the dog is where this case gets genuinely strange. Robert Fisher was, by all accounts, closer to that dog than he was to his own family. Blue was a fixture of his life. Witnesses described it as an unusual, almost excessive attachment. So if Fisher drove into the forest to die, why did he leave Blue outside the car? Why not take the dog with him? Why not, and this is the harder question, put the dog down before he walked away to spare it 10 days of hunger and confusion waiting by an abandoned vehicle? The answer that makes logical sense is that Blue wasn't an oversight. Blue was a prop. A dog faithfully guarding an abandoned car is a scene that says someone went into the woods and didn't come back. It focuses attention on the surrounding forest. It says, search here. While search teams were crawling through cave systems 100 miles from Scottsdale, a man with 10 days of head start and substantial survival skills could have been 1,000 miles away. Here's what we know about that 4Runner's location. It was abandoned near the Fort Apache Indian Reservation. That terrain, if you know it, Bean and Fisher did, connects to routes that can take a skilled hiker to highways, to reservation land where jurisdictional complications slow down law enforcement, and ultimately to the border. Mexico is achievable from that part of Arizona on foot for someone who knows what they're doing. Fisher was a competitive hunter who had spent years in this specific region of wilderness. He knew the landscape, he had scouted it. That last part needs a moment. 2 weeks before the murders, Robert Fisher went on a camping trip in the exact location where the 4Runner was later found. His camping companion said afterward that Fisher seemed distracted during the trip. Not relaxed, not enjoying himself. He seemed to be studying the area, looking at the terrain with a purpose that didn't match a weekend getaway. That is not a man wandering. That is a man preparing an exit route, and he had skills that could sustain a new life. He was a trained respiratory therapist and surgical technician. Those skills transfer across state lines and international borders. Someone with that training can find work in medical facilities without a perfect paper trail, especially in regions where demand is high and oversight is thin. The FBI noted this specifically in their profile. Fisher had the technical background to rebuild under a new name. 20 years on the 10 most wanted list, hundreds of reported sightings across the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and not one confirmed piece of evidence that Robert Fisher is dead. In June of 2002, Robert Fisher was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, one of the most exclusive and notorious designations in American law enforcement. He stayed on that list for 20 years of sightings called in, 20 years of tips investigated and exhausted. In 2021, the FBI quietly removed his name, not because he was found, not because he was confirmed dead, because they had run out of leads. The case went cold in the most public and official way possible. Mary Fisher was 38 years old, Brittany was 13, Bobby was 10. They did nothing except live in the same house as a man who decided that losing control of his family was a worse outcome than ending it. Their bodies were found in the rubble of a house that was destroyed to cover up what he had done. They deserved better than a cold case file. They deserved better than 20 years of a manhunt that found nothing. Here is the thought I can't shake. If Robert Fisher is alive, and there is no confirmed evidence that he is not, he has been living somewhere for over 2 decades. He is in his mid-60s now. He may have a different name, a different job, a different face, shaped by years and maybe surgery. He may have built another life in another town with people who have no idea who he is or what he did on the night of April 9th, 2001. He could be anywhere. He could be no one. That is what makes this case different from a desert disappearance or a cold case file. The monster in this story is not the wilderness. It's not the heat or the canyon or the floodwaters. It's a man, a specific, identifiable, still potentially living man who killed his family, blew up his house, left his dog by the car, and walked away. And the cave in the Tonto National Forest may be empty. Picture the Tonto National Forest on Memorial Day weekend. 3 million acres of pine forest and canyon country spread across the Mogollon Rim in central Arizona. Every year, families pour in for the long weekend, tents going up, coolers being dragged from truck beds, kids chasing each other through the trees. The roads out here are mostly dirt, narrow, winding, cut through the pines at a pace that says, slow down, breathe, you're not on the highway anymore. There's no cell signal. There's no noise except the kind nature makes. It is, in other words, the absolute last place on Earth you would expect to see a commercial semi-truck. Let me tell you about Devin Williams, 29 years old, married, father of 3 kids back home in America's Kansas, a long-haul trucker with a clean record and a reputation his boss described with one word: reliable. He passed every mandatory drug test, had no history of mental illness, no criminal record, nothing in his background that would make you look twice. He was a working man with a family he was trying to get back to. His boss said the run Devin was on, a standard produce haul from California to Kansas City, was completely routine. Nothing unusual about the assignment, nothing unusual about Devin when he left. He was hauling a load of strawberries, perishable cargo, time-sensitive, the kind of load that keeps you focused on the interstate and moving. And then, somewhere in Arizona, something changed. Something that would lead Devin Williams's 10-ton, the 48-foot semi-truck into the middle of a forest it had absolutely no business being in, and leave it there, engine cooling in a muddy meadow while Devin walked off into the pines and was never seen alive again. On May 27, 1995, Devin called his boss from Kingman, Arizona. That call was the last normal contact anyone had with him. He mentioned he hadn't been sleeping well. He was fighting insomnia and was behind schedule, but he told his boss he was pushing through. He was going to make the delivery. He was going to stay on track. The next morning, May 28th, Devin's truck appeared in the Tonto National Forest. Not on a highway, not on any road a commercial vehicle has a reason to be on. He was on Rim Road 300, a narrow, winding dirt track through the pine forest, miles from the nearest interstate. And he wasn't crawling carefully along it. Witnesses said he was moving fast, the way you move on an open freeway, not the way you pick your path through the trees. The rig was barreling through, branches scraping the sides of the trailer, the whole thing swaying on a road that was never designed for anything bigger than a pickup truck. Campers dove out of the way. Family vehicles swerved onto the shoulder, the ones that had a shoulder to swerve onto. One witness, a woman named Lynn Yarrington, nearly got hit head-on. She said afterward that what terrified her most wasn't the size of the truck. It was Devin's face. He had no expression at all, not fear, not frustration, not the look of a man who knows he's made a catastrophic wrong turn. She said he looked straight through her, robotic. Like the lights were on, but no one was operating the controls. Eventually, the inevitable happened. The truck went into a meadow where the ground couldn't hold it and sank into the mud, stuck fast. Nowhere to go. A camper named Charles Hall approached the truck and found Devin outside the cab. What he witnessed next is the image that has stayed with this case for 30 years. Devin was pacing in the grass beside his truck, muttering to himself. He had a $20 bill, and he was crouching down, pressing it against the earth with a rock, pressing it over and over like he was trying to pin something down or crush something flat. Hall tried to talk to him. Devin looked up. He said, "I didn't do it. They did." He pointed at his own truck, and then he said, "I'm going to jail." Hall went to find help. When he came back, Devin was gone. But he had walked off into the forest. Police arrived. The truck was there, engine still warm, cab clean and tidy, cargo intact, his duffel bag missing, but his briefcase and wallet left on the seat. But Devin Williams was not there. Search teams moved in immediately. Dogs, helicopters, ground crews working a grid through the trees. They found nothing. No footprints they could follow, no clothing snagged on branches, no sign of a man at all. The forest had swallowed him completely. Let's start with the detour itself, because this is the question that has no clean answer. Devin Williams was an experienced long-haul trucker. He knew these routes. He knew his truck, 48 feet of trailer behind him, 10 tons of weight, a turning radius that makes city driving a white-knuckle exercise. He was hauling strawberries, which means he was on a clock. But perishable cargo doesn't wait, and he was already behind schedule. So why does a man like that veer 50 miles off the interstate and drive into a national forest? Not just drive in, but keep driving, deeper, past the point where any trucker would stop and say, "I need to back this thing out before I get stuck." He had to have known the road was wrong. He had to have felt the ground softening. Professional drivers develop an instinct for these things. And yet, he kept going. That's not a wrong turn. A wrong turn is when you get off at the wrong exit and spend 5 minutes figuring out how to get back on. This is something else entirely. Now, let's talk about the $20 bill. A man pressing a piece of currency against the dirt with a rock over and over while muttering to himself. That is not frustration. That is not the behavior of a tired driver who got lost and is irritated about it. That is a dissociation from reality so complete that normal human logic has stopped operating. The connection between that action and any rational goal is completely severed. Whatever was happening inside Devin Williams's mind at that moment, it was not the mind of a man who understood where he was or what he was doing. So what happened to him? There are 3 serious theories, and none of them fully close the case. The most likely answer is sleep deprivation psychosis. Devin told his boss on the 27th that he hadn't been sleeping. After 72 to 96 hours without proper sleep, the human brain begins to generate waking hallucinations, complete, vivid, entirely convincing experiences that the sleep-deprived person cannot distinguish from reality. But Devin may have been seeing things on that highway that sent him off the road. He may have been responding to threats or instructions that existed only in his deteriorating brain chemistry. The robotic stare, the paranoid statements about going to jail, the "they did it" directed at his own truck. All of this is textbook severe sleep deprivation psychosis. It is a medical emergency that can happen to anyone who pushes too hard on too little rest. But here's the thing. Witnesses also described what sounded like rapid jaw movement, a nervous, grinding quality to the way Devin was moving his lower face. That is a specific physiological indicator that has a different explanation. Stimulant use. Amphetamines. The kind of thing long-haul drivers have used for decades to stay awake on overnight runs. Not because Devin was reckless, his record was clean, but because the pressure of the industry has always pushed drivers toward staying awake at any cost. A stimulant-induced psychotic break would produce nearly identical symptoms to sleep deprivation psychosis, but it would come on faster and harder. There's a third possibility that is quieter and darker. Carbon monoxide, a slow leak from the truck's exhaust system into the cab, can cause confusion, paranoia, and eventually behavior that looks indistinguishable from a mental health crisis. The victim doesn't know it's happening. They feel increasingly strange and frightened and disconnected, and they can't name why. By the time the CO levels are high enough to cause the behavior witnesses described, the damage can be severe. Devin was in that cab alone for hours. If there was a leak, no one would have known until it was too late. And now the question I cannot let go of. The search teams that went into that forest after Devin vanished were extensive. Dogs trained to find human scent, helicopters with thermal imaging, experienced search and rescue personnel working a methodical grid. They searched for days and found nothing. 2 years later, May 1997, hikers found Devin's skull, a quarter mile from where his truck was abandoned. That is not a remote, inaccessible location. That is a short walk from the meadow where everyone was searching. How do professional search teams with cadaver dogs miss remains that hikers stumble across 2 years later in the same zone? The only answers are that the remains were moved there after the initial search, by weather, by animals, or something else, or that the grid missed a section it believed it had covered. Neither answer satisfies. Neither answer is complete. Only the skull was found. No other bones, no clothing, no personal effects beyond what was left in the cab. The cause of death was never officially determined. The rest of Devin Williams, the man who drove that rig, who married, who had 3 children, who called his boss from Kingman and promised he was going to make the delivery, was never recovered. His family never had a full answer. They had a skull and a theory. His wife and his 3 kids got a partial accounting of where he ended up, but nothing that explained how he got there. Nothing that explained why. What I keep coming back to is that last phone call from Kingman, a man saying he was tired but pushing through, focused on his cargo, his deadline, his family waiting in Kansas, a man who by all accounts was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. Somewhere between that highway and that meadow, something broke. Something inside Devin Williams shifted so completely that he drove a 48-foot truck into a pine forest, pressed a $20 bill into the dirt with a rock, and walked away from the only world he knew. The rig is gone now. The meadow is quiet. But in May of 1995, campers on a long weekend saw something that made no sense. A ghost rig materializing out of the trees, piloted by a man who wasn't there anymore. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. No explanation fully closes this case. No theory accounts for every detail, and the Tonto National Forest, as it always does, kept its secrets. There's exactly one day on the school calendar that feels like pure oxygen. Not Christmas morning, not a snow day, the last day of the school year. The moment that bell rings, you're not a student anymore. You're free. The summer stretches out in front of you like it might last forever, and for one afternoon, you actually believe it might. May 17th, 2001. Paradise Valley High School in Phoenix, Arizona. Junior year is over. Kids are flooding the parking lot, signing yearbooks in the shade, making plans for tonight, for next week, for the rest of the summer. The air smells like sunscreen and exhaust fumes and possibility. Alyssa Turney was 17. silver eyeshadow, a stack of bracelets on her wrist, a big, wide smile that her sister Sarah describes as impossible to forget. She worked at Jack in the Box after school. She had a boyfriend. She was looking forward to her senior year, and she had a graduation party to get to that very night. She'd told her boyfriend to expect her. On the surface, Alyssa looks like every 17-year-old girl on the last day of school. But here's the part that doesn't make it into the yearbook photos. Alyssa Turney's home was not a normal home. Her mother had died of cancer when Alyssa was 9, and since then she had been living with her stepfather, Mikelle Turney. To the outside world, Mikelle was a grieving father figure, a Navy veteran, an electrician, a man managing a difficult situation. But inside that house on East Bell Road, Mikelle Turney had built something else entirely. He had wired the walls, hidden cameras in the rooms, recording devices on every phone line, every call Alyssa made, to friends, to her boyfriend, onto anyone, was being archived. Every movement she made inside that house was logged. It was a domestic surveillance apparatus that would have looked extreme in a government facility, let alone a suburban family home. Alyssa Turney lived under total technological watch, and she was 17. That's who we're talking about. A girl trying to be a normal teenager while living inside a prison she couldn't prove existed. That morning, Alyssa stopped by her boyfriend's woodworking class, leaned in the doorway, told him she'd see him at the party that night. She was smiling. That is the last confirmed independent sighting of Alyssa Turney by anyone outside the family. A girl in a doorway, making plans for an evening that would never happen. Around noon, Mikelle Turney arrived at Paradise Valley High School and picked Alyssa up early. He told investigators they went home together. He said they had an argument. He said Alyssa got angry and walked out. He said he found a note in her room later that afternoon, written in her hand, saying she was running away to California. He said he came home at 5 p.m. and she was simply gone. He waited, and then, eventually, he called police. Phoenix police arrived. They saw the note. They heard the story, and they made a decision that would haunt this case for nearly 2 decades. They classified Alyssa Turney as a runaway, a teenage girl who had a fight with her dad and took off. Case filed, investigation minimal. Mikelle Turney remained a grieving, cooperative stepfather who was worried about his daughter. 3 weeks later, he told police Alyssa had called him from California. She swore at him, he said, then hung up. It was the last anyone would supposedly hear from her. Alyssa's younger sister, Sarah, grew up in that house after May 17th. She grew up believing her sister had abandoned her, that Alyssa had just decided to leave, to start over somewhere, without saying goodbye. Sarah carried that her entire childhood, the grief of being left behind by someone who chose to go. For 7 years, that was the official story. Runaway teenager, somewhere in California. End of file. Let's talk about what a runaway actually looks like. Because I think we have to be precise here. When a teenager genuinely decides to run away, truly makes the choice to leave and start over, they take things. They take money. They take their phone. Because that phone is their lifeline and their connection to the only friends they have. They take their ID. Take their money. In 2001, Alyssa Turney had $1,800 sitting in her bank account. In 2001, for a 17-year-old working at Jack in the Box, that was a serious amount of money. That was months of saved paychecks. That was her safety net, her freedom, the thing that makes running away to California actually survivable. She never touched it. Not one withdrawal, not 1 cent. Her cell phone was left at the house. Her jewelry was still there. Her car, her own car, was still in the driveway. She left for California with no money, no phone, no ID, no transportation, and no belongings. And somehow, she made it. Somehow she got there. Somehow she called, a once from an untraced line, and was never heard from again. Ask yourself, genuinely, does that sound like someone who ran away? Or does that sound like someone who never left? Now, here's the thing about Mikelle Turney and his surveillance system. He told police he reviewed all 8 hours of his homemade security footage from May 17th and found nothing useful. He said the footage showed nothing out of the ordinary, and then he declined to hand the tapes over to investigators. Just declined. They existed. He confirmed they existed, and he would not produce them. And he had one more explanation: his automatic phone recording system, the device that was archiving every call made from that house, was not activated on May 17th, the one day that mattered, the one call from California he claimed to have received. The machine that never missed a call in its operational history had, on that specific afternoon, simply not been running. Every piece of his surveillance apparatus conveniently failed or was withheld on the one day it was most needed. Let's move to 2008. Police finally obtain a warrant for the Turney property, not because of Alyssa, but because of a separate tip about illegal weapons. What they find when they walk through that door is not the home of a grieving, cooperative stepfather. They find 26 improvised explosive devices, pipe bombs, handmade and functional. They find silencers. They find 19 unregistered firearms, and they find a 97-page manifesto, a detailed written plan to blow up a union hall belonging to the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, a grudge Mikelle Turney had been cultivating for years. But he was convicted for the weapons charges, and he served his time. But hold on a second, because I need you to understand what this information does to the original story. The man who told police his daughter just walked out the door with nothing and ran away to California. That same man was secretly building pipe bombs in his house and writing a 97-page plan for mass violence. This is not the profile of an honest witness. This is a man who was leading a double life of extraordinary, calculated secrecy. And police accepted his version of events for 7 years. When Sarah Turney, now an adult, finally confronted Mikelle directly and asked him what happened to Alyssa, his response was this: "Come to my deathbed, and I'll give you all the answers you want to hear." Sit with that for a moment. That is not the response of an innocent man. That is not the response of someone who doesn't know where his stepdaughter is. That is a man confirming he has answers and choosing deliberately to make you wait for them until he's dying. Here's the part of this story that is genuinely unprecedented. Sarah Turney, who grew up in that house, who spent her childhood being told her sister abandoned her, eventually realized the truth. She started talking about it publicly. She opened a TikTok account. And she told her sister's story in the plainest, most direct terms she could find, video by video, to anyone who would listen. The internet listened. The videos went viral. Thousands of people shared them. And the pressure of that public attention, a cold case from 2001 suddenly being watched by millions, forced the Arizona Attorney General's office to act. In August 2020, nearly 20 years after Alyssa disappeared, Mikelle Turney was indicted for her murder. A TikTok account did what 2 decades of official investigation had not. And now, the gut punch. Because this story doesn't end where you want it to. In 2023, a judge dismissed the murder charges against Mikelle Turney. The reason? Insufficient physical evidence. Alyssa's body has never been found. Without remains, without forensic proof, the circumstantial case, the pipe bombs, the surveillance, the missing tapes, the $1,800 left untouched, the deathbed comment, was not enough to go to trial. Mikelle Turney walked out of the courthouse a free man. He is alive. He has never told anyone where Alyssa is. We talk a lot about monsters in the context of true crime. We picture them lurking in the dark, in remote places, in parking garages. We imagine them as recognizably evil, someone you'd clock immediately as wrong. But Alyssa Turney's story asks you to look at a different kind of danger, the kind that drives you to school, the kind that files a missing persons report with police and tells them a cooperative story, the kind that sits across from you at the dinner table every night, watching you, recording you, planning. Alyssa Turney was last seen stepping out of a car driven by her stepfather on May 17, 2001. She never made it to the party. She never spent the $1,800. She never picked up the phone. Sarah Turney is still looking, still talking, still refusing to let her sister become just another cold case file gathering dust on a shelf. Because Alyssa was real. She had silver eyeshadow and a stack of bracelets, and a smile her sister has never been able to forget. And someone knows exactly what happened to her on the last day of her junior year. Here's what most people don't understand about the Grand Canyon. From the rim, it looks like a painting, like something so enormous it can't touch you. But the canyon doesn't exist at the rim. It exists at the bottom, and down there, in late November of 1928, you were in one of the most hostile environments in North America. The water temperature was close to freezing. The air temperature dropped into the 20s at night. The walls on either side of you were a mile high and completely vertical, which meant there was no way out except forward through whatever the river had waiting. There were no other expeditions running the canyon in late 1928. No radio, no emergency signal, no rescue operation that could reach you in less than days. If something went wrong in the lower canyon, you were alone with it until it was over. Glenn Hyde knew all of this, and he went anyway. He was 26 years old, newly married, and possessed of the particular confidence that belongs to young men who have not yet encountered the thing that stops them. He had already run other rivers, the Salmon, sections of the Snake, and he believed he understood what fast water required of a person. He had designed and built the craft himself, a 20-foot flat-bottomed sweep scow, wooden and heavy, steered with long oars at the bow and stern. It was not an elegant vessel, but Glenn was convinced it was enough. His wife, Bessie, was 22, an art student. She had married Glenn 4 months earlier, and she was on this river because he wanted her here, specifically because Glenn wanted Bessie to become the first woman to complete a full run of the Grand Canyon, which would cement the expedition's place in the record books. Whether Bessie wanted that distinction for herself is a question her diary answers in certain passages with a clarity that is uncomfortable to read. She was tired. She was frightened. But she was on the river, and the river was moving, and there was no easy way off. They launched on October 20th, 1928, from Green River, Utah. The upper canyon sections went hard but passable. By the time they reached the South Rim in mid-November, they had run most of the canyon's famous rapids and were ahead of schedule. Glenn was in good spirits. The record was within reach. On November 16th, they tied the scow at the base of the Bright Angel Trail and hiked up to the South Rim. They needed to resupply. Lat and Glenn wanted to meet Emery Kolb, the legendary Grand Canyon photographer whose studio sat at the top of the trail and whose reputation in the canyon ran deep. They spent a day and a half on the rim, ate a real meal, slept in a real bed. Kolb spent time with them. He was experienced enough to read what he saw, and what he saw troubled him. Bessie was quiet, worn down in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. She didn't speak much about the remaining run. When Kolb offered them life jackets from his stock, Glenn refused. He called them artificial aids, said they were unnecessary, said real river runners didn't need them. Kolb pressed the offer. Glenn declined again. On November 18th, they hiked back down the Bright Angel Trail and got back in the scow. That is the last confirmed sighting of Glenn and Bessie Hyde by anyone outside the canyon. Bessie's journal has a final entry dated November 30th, written at River Mile 225, 12 days after they left Kolb's studio. The entry is ordinary in its tone, notes on the river, on camp, on the weather. Nothing that suggests they knew what was coming. The journal simply stops after that entry, the way journals stop when someone puts them down, intending to pick them up again, and never does. They failed to arrive at their expected endpoint. Their families waited. Days passed. A search was organized, and Army observation planes began flying the canyon looking for any sign of the expedition. On December 19th, a pilot spotted the sweep scow at River Mile 237, 12 miles below Bessie's last journal entry, caught in an eddy on the river's edge. A ground search party reached the boat on December 25th. The scow was upright, intact, fully loaded. Glenn and Bessie were nowhere. Let's look at the boat, because the boat is the entire mystery. Between River Mile 225, where Bessie's last journal entry was written, and River Mile 237, where the scow was found, there's a stretch of canyon that contains some of the Colorado's most punishing water. River Mile 232 is a rapid known informally as the Fangs for the submerged granite teeth that break the surface at certain water levels. Historian Otis Marston, who spent decades studying the Hyde case, identified the fangs as the most likely point of the incident, a place where a collision with submerged rock could have happened at a speed and angle that ejected the occupants without capsizing the boat itself. Now, here's the thing. But that's a physically plausible sequence of events. A sweep scow hits a submerged rock at the right angle. The occupants are thrown into the water. The boat, heavy and flat-bottomed, continues downstream without them, eventually catching in the eddy at mile 237. Glenn and Bessie are swept under or carried downstream in water cold enough to incapacitate a person in minutes. The canyon holds them. That's the accident theory, and it has the advantage of not requiring anything unusual. But then let's look at what was on the boat. All of their food, all of their supplies, Bessie's diary, their camera, every piece of gear they had been traveling with for 6 weeks was still strapped to the deck, undisturbed. And their winter coats. Their heavy winter coats were still on the boat. It is November in the Grand Canyon. The air temperature at the canyon floor in late November drops below freezing at night. The river water is somewhere close to 40 degrees, cold enough that immersion without protection kills you in minutes. A person who fell into that water without a coat was not going to swim to shore and hike out. They were going to die in the river. And yet, both coats were on the boat, neatly stowed. If the accident theory is correct, if both Glenn and Bessie were thrown into the river, then they were both in that water without coats in November. That's a death sentence so fast it doesn't leave time for anything else. The coats being on the boat makes the accident theory work, but only in the worst possible way. They went in and they didn't come out and the river took them. But here's what doesn't fit. If one of them fell in, say Glenn goes overboard first, the other one is still on the boat. The boat is still moving. There is a decision to make. You can stay on the boat and try to pull him out. You can jump in after him. Or, if he's clearly gone, you can ride the boat to calmer water and survive. A person in that situation does not calmly remove their coat and leave it on the deck before going into the river. They go in the way people go into emergencies, fast, without preparation, with whatever they're wearing. So the coats are a problem. They're either evidence of an accident so sudden there was no time for anything, which means neither person voluntarily entered the water, or they're evidence of something else entirely. The something else. Bessie. Emery Kolb saw something at the rim on November 16th that stayed with him. Look, he saw a young woman who was frightened and exhausted and married to a man who was pushing her to finish a journey she had never wanted to be on. He offered life jackets. The husband refused for both of them. In the decades after the Hydes disappeared, Kolb was never entirely comfortable with the official story, the pure accident theory. He kept his notes, kept his photographs from that meeting, kept the case alive in conversations with canyon historians. In 1971, a woman on a commercial river trip through the Grand Canyon told a guide she was Bessie Hyde. She said Glenn had become violent on the river, that she had killed him in self-defense somewhere below mile 225, that she had hiked out of the canyon alone and rebuilt her life under a new name. The guide told the story. It spread. And then the woman recanted, said she had made it up, said she had been caught up in the storytelling of a campfire night. The confession was withdrawn. You can dismiss the recanted story. It was never verified, and recantations mean something. But the underlying question it raises, whether the dynamic between Glenn and Bessie left room for something other than a shared accident, is one that the physical evidence doesn't foreclose. Searches of the Grand Canyon found no bodies. The Colorado River in the Lower Canyon is not the kind of river that surrenders what it takes. The walls are too sheer, the water too fast and cold, the terrain too vast. Glenn and Bessie Hyde were simply gone, and the canyon simply kept them. For decades, people tried to solve the case by finding Bessie alive. A river guide named Georgie White ran the Grand Canyon commercially for 40 years and became a legend in the canyon community. She was tough, unconventional, and fiercely private about her past, and there were people who were convinced she was Bessie Hyde, living under a different name. When Georgie White died in 1992, investigators examined her belongings and found documents establishing her real identity. She was not Bessie Hyde. The theory was wrong, but the fact that it persisted for so long tells you something about this case. We want Bessie to have survived. We want there to have been agency in her story, a choice, an escape, a life that continued past mile 225. The alternative is simply that the river took them both. A flat accident, a flat scow, floating empty in an eddy, when telling us only that they were here, and then they were not. Glenn Hyde wanted a record. He wanted his name on something permanent. What he left behind is a boat, perfectly intact, fully loaded, floating in an eddy, and a question that has echoed off those walls for nearly 100 years without an answer. There's a particular cruelty in the way that a crowded city can make you feel invisible. Scottsdale is a city of 250,000 people, restaurants and bars and golf courses and resort pools, and the constant, low hum of a city that has decided comfort is its defining feature. It is, by almost every external measure, a good place to be. And for someone fighting a war they brought home inside them, it can feel completely hollow. Jesse Conger was 37 years old in the summer of 2019. He was a Marine combat veteran who had served in the Middle East, and he had come back carrying what a lot of veterans carry, PTSD, that doesn't respond to the civilian world's timetable for moving on. He struggled. He had hard stretches and better stretches, and in August of 2019 he was in one of the hard ones. But the people in his life, his girlfriend, his family, could see it. They were watching him. The way you watch someone you're worried about, trying to read the signals, trying to stay close enough to help without pushing him further away. But here's what you need to understand about Jesse Conger before this story goes where it goes. He was not a man without resources. He was a Marine rescue swimmer, not just military, but specifically trained for the kind of situations where ordinary survival skills stop being enough. His job had been to survive extreme conditions and pull other people out of them. He understood terrain, he understood heat, he understood how a human body performs under maximum stress. If there was anyone in Arizona who should have been able to handle the wilderness, it was this man. He also had a service dog. His Anchor, the animal trained specifically to recognize his PTSD episodes and respond to them, to interrupt the spirals, to give him something physical and present to focus on when his own mind became the enemy. For a veteran in that specific kind of pain, a service dog is not a companion the way a pet is a companion. It is clinical, it is functional, it is the difference between a night that ends okay and one that doesn't. On August 14th, 2019, Jesse Conger was seen at his Scottsdale apartment for the last time, and then he was gone. When his girlfriend and family went to check on him, the apartment was unlocked. Jesse wasn't there. His 2015 silver Toyota Tacoma was gone from the parking lot. That was not on its own alarming. People leave, people drive, but then they looked around the apartment. His cell phone was on the counter. His wallet was there, his identification, the things that connect a person to their own life, to their money, to their ability to exist in the modern world. All of it left behind. And in the apartment, alone, was the service dog. Pacing. Waiting. The animal trained to keep Jesse tethered to the present, abandoned in a locked apartment with no explanation and no water for however long Jesse had already been gone. The Scottsdale Police Department opened a missing persons case. The veteran community rallied immediately and hard. Marines and former service members organized search parties, spread the word across every platform they had, pushed Jesse's name and face into as many feeds as they could reach. A philanthropist named Bill Polt posted a $30,000 reward for information. The search was thorough, organized, used and sustained by people who refused to let a fellow veteran disappear quietly. For 5 months, there was nothing. Then, in January 2020, Jesse's silver Toyota Tacoma was found on the San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation, about 100 miles east of Scottsdale. It was parked on a remote dirt road near the Arizona Eastern Railway's tracks, at the end of a path that required you to know it was there to find it. The truck was covered in 5 months of desert dust, left long enough that the grime had built up into a layer. But it had a full tank of gas. The keys were still in the ignition. There was hunting and fishing gear in the back, and Jesse's 9mm pistol was not in the truck. It wasn't in the apartment either. It was gone somewhere with him. Search teams moved into the surrounding terrain. The San Carlos Reservation is rugged country, volcanic ridges, dry washes, dense scrub. Cadaver dogs and drones and volunteers worked the land around the truck's location. They found nothing. No footprints they could follow, no camps, no gear, no trace of a man who had been there. The reservation's jurisdiction required coordination between Scottsdale PD and the San Carlos Apache tribal government, which added procedural complexity to a search that was already fighting against 5 months of wind and weather having erased whatever ground evidence might have existed. Jesse Conger has not been found. I want to start with the dog, because I think it's the detail in this case that doesn't get enough attention. A service animal for a combat veteran with PTSD is not incidental. It's not a nice thing to have around. The dog is trained to respond to the veteran's specific physiological stress responses. The elevated heart rate, the change in breathing, the behavioral patterns that precede a crisis episode. The bond between a veteran and a service dog builds over months of training and daily interaction until the animal can read that specific person in ways that other humans often can't. For Jesse, in the hard stretch he was in during August of 2019, that dog was doing the work that medication and therapy couldn't fully reach. So ask yourself, if you were going into the desert to clear your head, to drive somewhere remote and spend time in the open air and come back when you were ready, would you leave your service dog locked in an apartment? If the dog is your anchor, you take the anchor with you. No, you don't leave it behind in a place where it can't eat or drink without someone coming to check on it. The only explanations for leaving the dog are ones that hurt to say. Either Jesse didn't intend to come back to feed it, meaning he had no expectation of returning, or he left it deliberately, knowing someone would find it and understand. A service dog left in an apartment is not an oversight. It is, in the darkest reading of this case, a message. But here's the thing. If that's the right reading, if Jesse drove into the desert to end his life, then a new set of questions opens up that doesn't have clean answers either. He left his phone, he left his wallet, he left his ID. Those items being left behind could mean he didn't plan on needing them, but he took his hunting gear. But he took a full tank of gas. Either he filled it on the way, or it was already full when he left, which in either case suggests a drive he was thinking about in advance. And he drove 100 miles from Scottsdale to the San Carlos reservation and parked on a specific remote dirt road that most people don't know exists. That level of destination-specific navigation suggests planning, not impulse, which brings us to what Jesse was, professionally. A marine rescue swimmer, search and rescue trained, elite wilderness survival skills. If Jesse walked away from that truck with the intention of not being found by search teams, by cadaver dogs, by drones, he had the training to make that very difficult. He knew how scent works, how search patterns work, and how to move through terrain in ways that don't leave the kind of evidence that ground teams are looking for. The theory that investigators have quietly raised and that the family has grappled with is that Jesse may have used the same skills he developed to save other people to systematically disappear himself. Not because he was running somewhere, because he knew how to make the wilderness hold a secret. Now, that is the darkest interpretation. And there are others. The area around San Carlos is remote in ways that have nothing to do with just distance from a city. Those dirt roads that run through that part of the reservation see traffic that isn't casual. A man parked alone on a known remote road in the pre-dawn hours could encounter people he didn't expect. The absence of Jesse's 9mm from both the apartment and the truck is a data point that cuts in multiple directions. It could mean he took it for reasons that confirm the darkest theory, or it could mean something happened on that road that nobody has investigated because there are no tells us he arrived with it. He wasn't tells us he arrived with it. He wasn't stranded. The keys in the ignition tell us he stepped away without urgency, or he wanted to leave the truck accessible. Neither detail points cleanly in any direction. His fellow Marines never stopped. The veteran community that organized when Jesse went missing didn't dissolve when the search teams went home. They kept posting. They kept circulating his face. They kept honoring the principle that you don't leave a Marine behind, even when behind means somewhere in a 100-mile radius of reservation land in central Arizona with no confirmed last position. Jesse Conger's family has lived with not knowing for years now. Not knowing is its own particular kind of damage. A disappearance without a body, without a confirmed cause, without a moment you can point to and say, this is where it ended. It doesn't close. You can't grieve what might not be over. You can't stop hoping when there's no evidence that hope is wrong. His family is held in that suspension because the desert hasn't said. Jesse Conger survived combat. He survived the training that kills strong men. He came home, which is something not every Marine gets to do. And he was fighting a different battle in a city that didn't always understand what he was fighting against. Whether he drove into the desert because he was broken, because he was running, or because something happened to him on a dirt road that nobody will ever know about, he deserved better than to disappear without an answer. The truck is gone now, impounded and processed. The dirt road looks the same as it always has, and somewhere, out in the desert east of Phoenix, on or near the San Carlos Apache Reservation, a Marine who spent his career finding people who were lost is himself still waiting to be found. Some cases start in the wilderness, some start in the dark. This one starts in broad daylight, on a regular street in a regular suburb, on a Wednesday so ordinary that nobody around it noticed anything wrong until it was far too late. Phoenix, Arizona, May 10th, 2017. The sun is up, the commute is moving, and the city is doing exactly what it does every weekday morning, going through the motions. On a residential street in the West Valley, there's a house that looks like every other house on the block. Same desert landscaping, same two-car driveway, same unremarkable front door. Nothing about it reads as a crime scene. Nothing about it suggests that in less than 24 hours, a woman who lived there would be gone. Christine Mustapha was 34 years old. She worked at Walgreens, had been there for 10 years, which is a detail that tells you something essential about her character. 10 years of showing up. 10 years of perfect attendance, the kind of employee that a manager doesn't replace, the kind of person whose coworkers can set their clock by. She had 2 children, including an 8-month-old baby. She was the center of her family's daily existence in the way that mothers of young children tend to be, the person everyone else's schedule orbits around. There was a shadow over that house, though. Her live-in boyfriend, Robert Interval. The relationship had been deteriorating for some time. Friends and family described tension, arguments, and a pattern of control that had been escalating. Christine had been talking about leaving, not vaguely, not someday, specifically with a plan, with urgency. She had started looking into a protective order. She had told people in her life that she was afraid of what Robert might do if she actually walked out. She was trying to find the right moment, the right way, the safe exit. On May 10th, 2017, that window closed. Christine finished her shift. She called her sister. The conversation was brief but clear. She was heading home, and she was ready to finally make the move. Take the kids, leave Robert. She had made the decision. After months of planning and fear and waiting for the right moment, May 10th was going to be the day she started over. And then she went home. On the morning of May 11th, Christine did not show up for work. Her manager noted it immediately, because this had never happened in 10 years, not once. Sick days, personal days, scheduled absences, fine. But an unexplained no call, no show, never. Her family already knew something was wrong before the manager picked up the phone. Christine's sister had been trying to reach her since the night before and getting nothing. Police responded to a welfare check at the residence. Robert Interval was home. He had the baby. He offered an explanation. They'd had a fight the night before. Christine had gotten upset and she walked out the door to go to work. He seemed calm, cooperative. He spoke to officers and answered their questions, but here's what the officers found when they looked around that house. Christine's car was in the driveway. Her purse was inside. Her wallet, her keys, her cell phone, all of it still in the home. Her work uniform was still there. And in the house with Robert Interval was Christine's 8-month-old baby. Her infant child, who had been left in the care of the man she had been afraid of, the man she was trying to leave. She hadn't walked out to go to work. She hadn't walked out at all. Everything that Christine Mustapha needed to exist in the world, her money, her transportation, her phone, her uniform, her child, was still in that house. She was not. Phoenix police opened a missing persons investigation. They worked quickly. And what started to emerge, as investigators dug into Robert Interval's movements and statements, was a picture of a man who had not been caught off guard, a man who had been preparing. Let's take Robert Interval's story seriously for a moment. Let's follow its logic. He says Christine walked out after a fight. He says she went to work. Okay, so walk me through what that looks like in practice. You are a 34-year-old woman. You have a 10-year history of perfect attendance at your job. You work a shift that requires a uniform. You are walking, not driving. Your car is sitting in the driveway to a job that is miles away in Phoenix in May, which means you are walking in the kind of heat that makes people collapse on the pavement. And you are doing all of this without your phone, without your wallet, without any money, and without your work uniform. You have left your infant child, 8 months old, with the man you are terrified of, the man you have been trying to leave for months, the man you told your sister you were going to get away from. That is not a woman walking out. That is not a woman going anywhere voluntarily. There is no version of that story that accounts for every item left behind. A woman leaving a toxic relationship in the heat of a fight might forget her phone. She might grab her keys and go. She does not leave her phone and her wallet and her keys and her car and her baby. She does not abandon every single thing that connects her to her life. Now, here's what investigators found when they looked beyond the front door. Witnesses who knew Interval told police he had made statements about having a plan for Christine, not the vague complaints of a frustrated partner. Specific statements said to specific people about what he was going to do. He had purchased materials that investigators described as consistent with body disposal. His phone records and cell tower data placed him in locations at times that contradicted his own account of where he had been and when. But every statement he made to police contained inconsistencies, and those inconsistencies, laid on top of each other, told a story that only went one direction. Investigators traced his movements to a garbage transfer station. He had been there on the day Christine disappeared. That led to a decision that is almost staggering in its scale: a search of the SR-85 landfill in Buckeye, Arizona. For 12 weeks, teams of 32 officers worked daily at that landfill in full hazmat gear under the Arizona summer heat. They identified specific cells of refuse based on GPS data from garbage trucks, tracking exactly which trucks had picked up from which routes on which days and where that material had been deposited. They sifted through over 21,000 tons of material. The search cost approximately $1.5 million. The Phoenix Police Department committed that money and those people and those months because the circumstantial case against Interval was strong enough to justify it. They found nothing. Not a bone, not a piece of clothing, not a single trace of Christine Mustapha. And now, here is the logic gap that this case turns on. If Robert Interval is innocent, where is Christine? Where did she go? She had no money. She had no car. She had no phone. Her family was waiting for her. Her job was waiting for her. Her 8-month-old baby was in that house. If she voluntarily left that house under her own power, she walked into a city that was looking for her and managed to completely disappear without a single person seeing her, without using her bank account once, without making a single call. She vanished more completely than almost any Jane Doe case in Arizona history. And she did it, supposedly, in anger, in the middle of the night with no resources. That doesn't happen. People don't vanish like that by choice, from a suburban house with nothing in their pockets. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office made a decision that prosecutors are always reluctant to make. They charged Robert Interval with second-degree murder. No body, no physical evidence of a crime, no crime scene, no blood, no remains. Just the totality of the circumstantial case, the statements he made, the things he bought, the timeline that didn't hold up, the phone data, and the profound, irreducible impossibility of Christine Mustapha voluntarily walking away from her baby. In April 2019, a jury convicted Robert Interval of second-degree murder. In June of that year, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. A no-body homicide conviction is one of the rarest outcomes in American criminal law. The legal system is built around physical proof, the corpus delicti, the body of the crime. Prosecutors who take these cases to trial without remains are betting on the jury's ability to follow logic to its only rational conclusion. In the Mustapha case, the jury followed it. But here is the thing that conviction cannot resolve. Christine Mustapha has not been found. The landfill search found nothing. The landscape around Buckeye, which has yielded the remains of other victims over the years, has not given up Christine. She is somewhere. She was a real person, 34 years old, a decade of perfect attendance, a sister she called from her car, and an 8-month-old who needed her. She is somewhere in Arizona, in all probability, and no one has found her yet. Robert Interval is in prison. That is justice of a kind, the kind that protects the public, that names the act and assigns it a consequence. But Christine's family does not have a grave to visit. They do not have the closure that comes from knowing exactly where she is and what happened to her on the night of May 10th. They have a verdict and an absence. Sometimes the law works exactly as it should and still leaves something unfinished. A dangerous man is behind bars because a jury believed the logic of the evidence when there was no body to anchor it. And somewhere in the vast sprawl of the Arizona desert, Christine Mustapha is waiting to be found. There is a particular kind of loneliness to the Mojave Desert that you don't fully understand until you're in it. You can drive out there for an hour on a highway and not see another vehicle. Not a gas station, not a rest stop, not a building. Just the road and the heat and the sense that you are very, very far from anything that could help you if something went wrong. That vastness is beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful. And it is an extraordinarily efficient place to disappear. August 1989, Mojave County, Arizona. The temperature out near the highway cutoffs between Old Temple Bar and White Hills roads is sitting somewhere north of 110 degrees, and the dirt paths that fork off into the scrub are the kind of roads that don't go anywhere useful. They go nowhere. They end. And at the end of one of them, tourists stumble across something that has no business being out there. A body, a young woman, brutally murdered, no identification, no car, no belongings that could tell investigators who she was. The Mojave County Sheriff's Office processed the scene, took fingerprints, documented everything they could, and opened a file. They called her Jane Doe. They worked the case. They hit walls. And eventually, the way cold cases do when leads dry up and budgets move on, the file went quiet. Jane Doe stayed Jane Doe for 33 years. Now let me tell you who she actually was. Marina Ramos was 28 years old in the summer of 1989. She was from Bakersfield, California, and she was the kind of mother you could recognize in a single interaction. Watchful, devoted, completely oriented around her children. She had 2 of them. Elizabeth, 13 months old. Jasmine, 1 month old. One barely walking, one barely able to hold her own head up. Marina carried both of them with her everywhere, because that's what you do when your children are that small and you are their only protection. You do not put them down. You do not let them out of your sight. That is who was driving toward Arizona in the summer of 1989. A young mother with 2 babies and a plan to start over somewhere new earlier that year, Marina had been arrested on a shoplifting charge. Brief incarceration. When she got out, she picked Elizabeth and Jasmine up from her cousin Esther, who had been watching them. She introduced Esther to a man she was traveling with. The family only ever knew him by one name, Fernando. Marina told Esther they were heading to Ontario, California to start a new chapter. She was excited, ready to move. She had the girls with her, and Fernando was driving. That was the last time her family saw any of them. When Marina's body was found weeks later in the Arizona desert, investigators had no way to connect the victim to a missing persons report because no missing persons report had been filed that matched her description. No one in the system was looking for Marina Ramos in Arizona. The people who knew her didn't know she was dead, and the people who found her didn't know who she was. The gap between those 2 facts, the gap where identity should have been, is where this case lived for 3 decades. Investigators processed everything they had. They had fingerprints. They entered them into available systems. Nothing matched. B, the case settled into that grim category of unresolved files that never fully close but never fully move either. Then, in February 2022, an investigator named Lori Miller at the Mojave County Sheriff's Office decided to try again. She resubmitted those same fingerprints, the ones taken in 1989, into the FBI's Modern Identification System, NAMUS. The technology had evolved enormously since 1989. Higher resolution, wider database, and this time, it found something. A match to a woman named Maria Ortiz, an alias connected to a shoplifting arrest in California. Investigators pulled the thread. Maria Ortiz was Marina Ramos. The Jane Doe in the Mojave Desert file was a 28-year-old mother from Bakersfield who had vanished alongside 2 infant daughters in the summer of 1989. And then investigators contacted Marina's family to deliver the identification. And someone in that family, after 33 years of not knowing, asked the question that froze the room. What happened to the babies? The investigators had no answer, because there were no babies at the 1989 crime scene. Not then. Not in any subsequent search. Elizabeth and Jasmine Ramos had been with their mother when she left Bakersfield. They were not with her when she was found. For 3 decades, while Marina lay in a cold case file without a name, her daughters had been somewhere in the world, completely unaccounted for. Let's think about what this crime actually required. Not just the murder. The murder is horrifying, but it follows a kind of terrible logic. What I want you to think about is what happened after. You have just killed a woman in the middle of a desert. You are in a vehicle. Your adrenaline is surging. Every instinct you have says, get out of here, get far away, leave nothing that can be traced back to you. That is the mindset of a person fleeing a murder scene. And in that vehicle, there are 2 infants. One is 13 months old. One is barely 4 weeks old. Babies cry. Not occasionally, constantly. A 1-month-old needs to be fed every 2 to 3 hours. She cannot tell you what she needs in any language except screaming. A 13-month-old is mobile enough to be difficult to contain and too young to understand what silence means. They are, from the perspective of a fugitive trying to avoid attention, the worst possible cargo. They are loud, they are high maintenance, and they are evidence. If you pull over at a gas station or a diner with 2 infants but no mother, people notice. So why take them? There are really only a few explanations, and none of them are comfortable. The first is that taking the babies was not an afterthought. It was the plan. In 1989, a healthy infant could be sold through informal networks for significant money. No Amber Alerts existed. No centralized database of missing children operated in a way that could cross-reference an unidentified murder victim in Arizona with 2 abandoned infants in California. The infrastructure of child protection in 1989 was a fraction of what it would become in subsequent decades. It is genuinely possible that the babies were the commodity, and Marina was removed because she stood between whoever wanted them and the transaction. The second possibility is more personal. Fernando, and we have to keep coming back to Fernando because he is the only name we have and he has never been publicly identified, had some connection to the children. A relationship, a family obligation, a reason to want them raised by someone specific rather than left in the desert. A killer who methodically disposes of a mother and then transports 2 infants across state lines doesn't do that out of spontaneous mercy. There is a reason. There is always a reason. And now, here is the part of this case that is genuinely unlike almost anything else in the Arizona cold case files. If Elizabeth and Jasmine Ramos are alive, and as of the time this investigation was reopened, there was no evidence they were not. They are adults. Elizabeth would be in her mid-30s. Jasmine would be in her mid-30s as well. They grew up somewhere. They have names that are not Ramos. They may have graduated from high school, gone to college, gotten married, had children of their own. They are walking around in the world right now, in all probability, with no idea that their lives are built on a foundation that includes a 1989 murder in the Mojave Desert and a mother who was stabbed and left on a dirt road before she turned 30. They might believe they were given up for adoption. They might have been told a cover story about their origins that they have never had reason to question. Their entire identity, the name they introduce themselves with, the birthday they celebrate, the family history they believe is theirs, may be a constructed fiction. And no one has told them otherwise because no one knew to look for them until 2022. In 2022, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children created age-progressed images of what Elizabeth and Jasmine Ramos might look like today. They released those images publicly, attached to the story of Marina's identification in the hope that someone would recognize a face, that someone would see a neighbor, a coworker, a friend, and think, "That looks like the woman in the picture." It's a strange kind of search. You're not looking for a child anymore. You're looking for a woman who doesn't know she's missing, who has never known she was missing, who has lived her entire life inside a story that someone else wrote for her in 1989. The murder investigation into Marina Ramos remains active. The man called Fernando has never been named publicly. The Mojave County Sheriff's Office continues to pursue leads, and investigators have noted that advances in genetic genealogy, the same technology that turned a distant DNA match into a living family connection for other cold cases, could close this one too. You don't need the killer's DNA to find the children, you need Elizabeth or Jasmine's DNA. And the most likely way that happens is if one of them, somewhere, takes an ancestry test. Now, think about that. Marina Ramos was identified after 33 years because her fingerprints from a shoplifting arrest were still in a database. The resolution to the rest of this case might come from a completely ordinary Saturday afternoon decision. A woman in her mid-30s, curious about her heritage, sending a saliva sample to a genealogy website. And the result coming back connected to a family in Bakersfield that has been waiting for 33 years to know what happened to the babies. Marina Ramos left Bakersfield with her daughters and a man named Fernando and did not reach her destination. She deserved better than a dirt road in the Mojave. She deserved better than 33 years of anonymity in a cold case file. Her daughters deserve to know who they are and where they came from, and somewhere out there, they might already be starting to wonder.